Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. And Frank, thank you for what you've just said and all the work that you do, that the union does at this very impressive trilingual conference. It's an example that British trade unions should well follow, because the British, as you know, are very bad at learning languages. And I apologize for that. This invitation today came about because of a discussion that Frank and I had in Mexico when we were there supporting with Steve the International Transport Workers Federation in developing trade unions in Mexico, with my wife Laura Alvarez, who works with the Peace and Justice Project on international things. And so what impresses me about this union is the efficiency of its organization, but also its global view and understanding of international solidarity. Because transport workers in Belgium obviously need support and protection from the trade union, and you have impressive levels of union membership in buses, in road transport, and on docks and airlines, as has been shown in the very good reports this morning. But across the world, transport workers are also facing massive, massive challenges. Global corporations driving up profits and driving down standards, which often puts safety and environment at risk. Therefore, the importance of the trade union involvement, not just in protecting living standards and conditions, but also enforcing greater safety. But we're also faced by huge challenges. One of them is artificial intelligence, the growth of algorithms, which in the media drives us into certain directions, not always good ones, and the importance of the trade unions not just being defeated by high technology and artificial intelligence, but getting a benefit from it. All previous industrial revolutions have resulted in a shift of wealth and power from the working class of the population to the entrepreneurs and to the biggest businesses. In the important green industrial revolution that we have to have, let's make sure this time it's the working class that benefit from it, not the very wealthiest within our society, by the creation of good quality new jobs, by ensuring that ultimately we have shorter working week, we have the equivalence of existing or much higher wages in the future. It is about redressing the imbalance that's going on. But we don't achieve any of that influence and any of that power without recruiting far more people into trade union membership. Not just here in Belgium, not just in my country, but all over the world. Because, as you've seen with the behavior of airlines, shipping companies, and all kinds of international transport, including international road transport, they're very adept at attacking the living standards of those in the countries where we have the strongest trade unions. It is not just a fight for survival, it's a fight to extend trade union membership and the culture of solidarity amongst workers. And I'm very impressed with what you've achieved with the recruitment of Uber drivers and others into membership, and the importance of taking self-employed people into membership, because many who work as self-employed drivers all around the world have an illusion that they're self-employed, that they decide their own future, decide their own lives. They don't. They are under the influence of a business somewhere that's deciding whether they get work or not, deciding how they do that work. And so the importance of trade union membership has to be emphasized all the time. But trade unions should not just be about defense and protecting conditions. It should be about demands for improved conditions, better working lives, but also changes within our society. This century, the 21st century, it's beset by wars and insecurity, the desperation of all those people that have died and continue to die in the many wars around the world, not just the terrible war in Ukraine. But it's also emphasized by what's happened over the past couple of years. That is a growing gap between the richest and the poorest within our society. Neoliberal economics came on the scene in the 1970s, and ever since then, it's been on the march. It's been pressed by international financial institutions, and it all relies on driving down wages and working class living standards and increasing profitability and the wealth that goes into tax havens. That wealth gap is obscene in many countries, including my own. But it's also an attack on the social wage. It's an attack on our health services, an attack on our social security systems, and on the very poorest within our society. And there's nowhere that's embraced neoliberal economics more than Britain, under Margaret Thatcher, and particularly since the 2010 general election, when the current government and its various forms came into office. At the moment, in my country, in Britain, 20% of the population, the richest 20%, own 60% of the wealth. A third of the population, in many parts, are living in the private rented sector, where they have no real protection at all, and in the last year alone, rent levels have gone up by 16%. Many people in the community that I represent in Parliament in North London are paying more than half of their take-home pay in rent. That means they're sharing very small, often very overcrowded flats. Is any of that necessary? Well, absolutely not. And last year alone, 750,000 people relied on food banks in order to eat properly in the fifth richest country in the world. 4.2 million children living in poverty. And, not surprisingly, there are more billionaires than ever in the history of my country. It is a disgrace. And you can only deal with these things by a radical economic strategy that fundamentally redistributes power and wealth. And across the European Union, there are 96 million people in real danger of going into desperate poverty immediately. They're less than a paycheck away from total poverty, and 1 million people are homeless across it. And then you look at what's the cause of all this. Frankly, it's corporate greed. The company Shell, which we all know very well, has just posted its highest profit level for over 115 years. It's posted profits of £32 billion in the last year that it reported. BP, not far behind with 23 billion. Every single one of those companies either gets tax write-offs against investments, tax write-offs on decommissioning, or, in the case of many companies, they're getting a direct subsidy to maintain profits in order to control energy prices, in the case of Britain, at 100% above what they were 2 years ago. And then we're lectured, as trade unions and the labour movement, that wages, high wages, cause inflation. They don't. Inflation has gone up because of corporate greed, because of profit-taking, because of tax write-offs for the very rich. In the case of my own country, the working class living standards are about a fifth lower than they were 15 years ago. We're living in an age of corporate greed, and we have to call it out for what it is. And that's why we've had strikes on the railways, in the post office, in civil servants, in trade unions, all through the teaching profession. And in the case of the postal workers, yes, it was a strike about getting higher wages, trying to get at least an inflation level increase. But it was also a fight back against the privatization of the post office, the postal services, some years ago, and their attempt to introduce a sort of Amazon, Uber style of employment practice. That was defeated by very resolute strike action by the members, who lost an awful lot of money in that campaign. Now, defeating something bad is obviously better than something bad happening. But defeating something bad doesn't improve living standards, it merely stops something worse happening. We have to be much more assertive for the future. Because the attempt to introduce the gig economy everywhere is desperate. This gig economy, where often young people rely totally on one of these to work or not work, to get paid or not get paid. And I've met people working for gig economy delivery companies who do not even know who their employer is, have never met anybody that works for that company, have never spoken to a human being. All they've done is accessed their mobile phone to get work or not get work, as the case may be. And so there is complete social isolation because of that. Those young workers, and they are mostly young workers, need to be in a trade union. And that's why I'm so pleased with the way that you've reached out to bring people into union membership in Uber and other places, because that, sadly, is where the growing employment is in our economy. And we as trade unionists have to get all of those people into union membership to give them the decent future. But it's also challenging those companies that try to relocate and outsource, as you've experienced and is experiencing all over, the endless chase for the lowest wages all around the world. So you've seen how industries have been destroyed across Europe. The garment industry, the steel industry has been severely damaged, and many others, by endless chasing of lower costs and lower wages somewhere else. That's where the importance of international trade unionism comes in. The worker in another country is not our enemy. They're our sister or our brother, and we have to work with them to get decent levels of income and protection for them. And I was so proud of the people of East London that came out in support of garment workers at Rana Plaza in Bangladesh when they suffered those terrible fires a few years ago because of their lack of safety. And then we mounted a boycott campaign on that, those clothes being imported in order to try and bring about safety for those workers. But I mentioned housing, I mentioned education, and I mentioned health. There is something awful that in the 21st century, we're turning education, health, and housing totally into commodities, not a right. I'm very proud that the Labour government that came in 1945 in Britain, as did many social democratic and socialist governments across Europe, introduced a universal health service, healthcare free at the point of use, as a human right. That is now under threat. Under threat by privatization within the National Health Service, under threat because of the greed of big pharma companies taking money out of our National Health Service, under threat because there are people, particularly in the United States, who see a healthcare market as an opportunity for them. Healthcare is a human right. We should fight for it, defend what we've got, and extend it to social care and so many other areas of life. Likewise, in education, growing privatization in many countries across Europe, attempts to commodify education, force higher education and university students deeper and deeper into debt just for getting an education. Surely, in the wealthiest continent in the world, in some of the richest countries in the world, we can well afford to provide universal free education from cradle to grave. So we face many challenges in fighting back against the economic injustices that have been put upon us. And I was very pleased with what Frank and others have said about the need to bring about unity within working class movements all across Europe. I'm a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and it meets in Strasbourg, and I'll be there next week. There are some great comrades there. Great comrades who argue for safety, for workers' rights, and adherence to the European Convention on Human Rights and support for the principle of the European Court of Human Rights. But, this is a big but, there is a significant body of extremely right-wing opinion within that body that, one, wants to break up the European Court of Human Rights and the whole European human rights agenda that was agreed after much deliberation in the late 1940s. But they also make the most appalling racist speeches attacking refugees and migrants all across Europe. And just like the far right in Germany in the 1920s blamed Jews for high inflation in the Weimar Republic and built the horror of the Nazi machine that engulfed the whole of Europe a bit later on. Always looking for a scapegoat, always trying to blame the most vulnerable people for the problems that we all face. Refugees didn't cause inflation. Refugees didn't cause the problems, the economic problems we have. They are people who are victims of war, of environmental disasters, and of human rights abuse. If the parties of the left and the trade unions all over concede ground to that right-wing argument and blame refugees for causing our problems, then we're on a very, very dangerous and very slippery slope. I was very pleased to hear of the big demonstration being called in December. We're doing similar demonstrations over this autumn. And whilst our media stoke up all kinds of horror stories about what refugees and asylum seekers do, they very seldom report the fact that so many of them work within our public sector, they contribute to our economy, and they enrich and strengthen our society. Don't be fooled and dragged into this gutter politics of attacking victims of wars and other issues around the world. They're human beings, just like all of us. Stand in solidarity with them, and that will make for a stronger community and a stronger society. The only way forward is that. I was delighted with the speech we just heard, thank you so much, on environment and sustainability, and I'll finish on this theme. Environment is a class issue. It's working class communities that breathe the worst air, eat the worst food, children who suffer the worst levels of pollution, and overall, people have much shorter life expectancies. It is a trade union issue. It is a class issue. And as we demand a green industrial revolution, which brings about sustainability, brings about sustainable transport, sustainable energy, and cleaner air, and protection of our natural world and enhancement of our biodiversity. Nature can live without us. We can't live without nature. And so it is an education process, and it is about developing all of that. That's why the trade union input into it. And I was very pleased when some years ago the PCS union, a big public sector union in Britain, produced a very interesting report pointing out that a green industrial revolution could create 1 million jobs a year. So what do we face as unions? We face attacks, of course. We've always faced attacks. How do we fight back? We fight back with solidarity. We fight back by recruiting people into unions. We fight back by inspiring young people to join a union and understand it. And we promote union education and promote education in our schools. The understanding of history frames the mindset of so many people. If they have a real understanding of how empires came about how industry came about how the inequalities of our society came about, they're better equipped to do something about it. So in our project, the Peace and Justice Project, we've got a simple 5 points. 1, pay, decent pay. 2, a Green New Deal to improve lives for everybody. 3, housing for all. 4, proper taxation of the very richest in corporations to pay for health and education services. And lastly, a world of peace where we don't blame the victims of war, instead we sort out the causes of war in order to prevent those wars in the future, and we defend the human rights agenda. Trade unions are the democratic glue within our communities. They're the democratic glue of our societies. But it doesn't all have to be miserable. It doesn't all have to be too serious. There's also music, there's also art, there's also hope, there's also culture. And even in the depths of depression in the United States in the 1930s, they said, yes, we want bread, but we want roses too. Thank you.